Hello, welcome to IN, a podcast series dedicated to contemporary visual art practices. IN is broadcast by New Local Space, a microgallery and contemporary art initiative in Kingston, Jamaica, and a subsidiary of audio production house Creative Sounds. Today's episode, hosted by writer and independent curator Nicole Smythe-Johnson, engages voices from various curatorial, critical, and historical positions within international and regional art institutions. The episode interrogates the social significance and functions of building art ecosystems in a range of geographical contexts. Our guests today are O'Neill Lawrence, Amanda Coulson, Dan Brown, and Raphael Fonseca. This episode is made possible in part by the support of the British Council Momentum Programme. O'Neill Lawrence is Senior Curator at the National Gallery of Jamaica and has been lead curator on several exhibitions at the NGJ, including 7 Women Artists in 2015, Masculinities in 2015, I Shall Return Again in 2018, and Beyond Fashion in 2018. He has contributed essays to publications on Caribbean art, including Pictures from Paradise, a survey of contemporary Caribbean photography, published by Robert and Christopher in 2012, and Historias Afro-Atlanticas Volume 2, Antologia for MASP 2018. Lawrence is an artist whose photography and video work has been included in exhibitions locally and internationally, such as Rockstone and Boot Heel at Real Art Ways in Hartford, Connecticut, shot in Kingston, Alice Yard, Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, and Vision Archipelique, Fondation Clément, Francois Martinique, and his solo exhibition Son of a Champion at Mutual Gallery in Kingston, Jamaica. In 2014, he was awarded the Society for Caribbean Studies Bridget Jones Award, and in 2018, he served on the board of the Davidoff Art Initiative. Lawrence is currently on the Advisory Council of the Caribbean Art Initiative. Amanda Coulson is a Bahamian-American art critic and curator based in Nassau, New Providence, the Bahamas, where she's currently the director of the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas. Coulson holds a master's degree from the Institute of Fine Arts at the New York University and has held positions at various galleries in New York, Paris, and London. She has served as English language editor of the international edition of Tema Celeste in Milan and has written for several art journals including Frieze, Frieze Deutsch, Modern Painters, Contemporary, Lapis, Art Review, and Art News. In 2005, she co-founded Volta Fair in Basel, Switzerland, serving as executive director since 2007 and overseeing the growth and development of the fair, including conception of the solo show format for the inaugural edition of Volta New York in 2008. Dan Brown is currently senior curator at the National Galleries of Scotland, working on the contemporary program. Prior to this, he was the curator of research at Edinburgh's Sculpture Workshop, where he developed a program of residencies, exhibitions, international exchanges, and partnerships designed to support the development of artists and promote public engagement with contemporary art. He was co-director of Embassy Gallery from 2006 to 2008 and served as visual arts advisor to the Scottish Arts Council from 2009 to 2011. He's co-founder of the Shift Work Program, a participatory research program for artists, curators, students, and academics with the aim of recalibrating artistic learning as a means of generating and transferring new knowledge. Raphael Fonseca is curator at the Contemporary Art Museum of Niterói in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He's also a lecturer at Colégio Pedro II in Rio de Janeiro and is a regular contributor to the publication Art Nexus. Fonseca was a contributing author for the catalogue of the 32nd Sao Paulo Biennial. Among his recently curated shows are The Sun Teaches Us That History is Not Everything at Osage Foundation, Hong Kong in 2018, Sleepers by Pierre Verger at Caixa Cultural, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 2018, Regina Vater May the Weather Be Good at MAC Niterói, Brazil in 2017 to 2018, Dur Lex Sed Lex, First Bienal sur Centro Cultural Parque de España, Rosario, Argentina 2017. Bestiary at Centro Cultural Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2017. When Time Presses, Palacio das Artes, Belo Horizonte, Brazil, Museo Histórico Nacional, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 2016. And Reply All at Grosvenor Gallery, Manchester, England in 2016. Fonseca was awarded the Centro Cultural Sao Paulo Curatorial Award in 2017 and the Marcantonio Villaça Curatorial Award in 2015.
I thought it would be a good idea to kind of start with basics. We have people from all over the world. So could you tell us a little bit about the art ecosystem in which you currently work, and how does your institution fit into that ecosystem? Let's start with Raphael.
I was born in Rio. I live in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and I work now in the Contemporary Art Museum of Niterói. Niterói is a city close to Rio, around 20 minutes by car. And of course, it's always complicated to describe the ecosystem that Rio is. Rio is such an important city in the art history in Brazil, not only in Brazil, but in a global sense too. But I think that in the last years, we can say that we are in the middle of a crisis, especially economic crisis, also political crisis. So I think we have our ecosystem has many problems dealing with how the federal government, the state of Rio's government, and also the city's government is able to fund the visual arts and is able to support the visual arts. So I'd say we are in this crisis, and I think that our museum, our institution, has the role to somehow give opportunities to artists to work in a different approach, because we're not a museum of the city of Rio, we're a museum of the city of Niterói. So I think we have a very important role in giving opportunity, giving space, and also funding some exhibitions there.
O'Neill.
I work at the National Gallery of Jamaica, which is a government institution. We are specifically to be serving the island, essentially. We have two branches, one in Kingston, the capital, and one in Montego Bay on the northwest coast. I think we are more of a culture that focuses on the performative. So the visual arts gets less attention as opposed to music. We are a government institution, so we do get some funding from the government, not enough to have a robust program. So we often get funding elsewhere. In terms of the purpose that we serve in our ecosystem, we're one of, I hesitate to say it, but truth is we're one of few platforms that contemporary and traditional artists can have a wide audience exposure in. So that is really, I think, where our institution fits. We try to be a lot of things, maybe too many things that many more things that you would expect a national institution to be. But as I said, there are fewer ones, so we try to be a lot of things to serve our constituents.
Dan, can you tell us a little bit about your context?
Well, thanks for inviting me to discuss this afternoon. I just want to be clear that when I'm going to talk about the ecosystem, I'm going to be talking about the Scottish ecosystem, particularly. While there's a lot of similarities and parallels across the whole of the UK, Scotland is quite distinct from the other nations that make up the United Kingdom in the sense that it has a separate education system, and the art colleges and their influence are very important. It has a separate funding body and system of funding for the arts. And it has a separate government, which, among other things, creates and steers cultural policy in a way that is distinct from the Westminster government. So currently I'm working at the National Gallery of Scotland, which is the big national institution. It's a federation of 3 different galleries looking at anything from 14th century Italian painting right up to the most contemporary art. I work in the contemporary art side, but I think I might talk about my other role previous to this, which was working at Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop, because the National Gallery sits somewhat to the side of the wider system of the ecology. So caveats done, I'll now describe the system that I operate within. And we have a very healthy art scene in Scotland. It's very diverse, and there's lots of support and infrastructure for artists, audiences, and lots of education that engages the populace in visual arts. So we've got great art schools, and they produce not only skilled and talented artists, but technicians, craftspeople, curators, writers, and all manner of cultural workers that go in to make up a healthy ecosystem. We have a range of galleries all across the country, from grassroots to big institutions like the National Galleries. But we also have a range of production facilities that provide artists with employment and affordable access to the tools of their labor. And then we have a lot of art fairs and cultural festivals that bring international audiences to Scotland. And currently we have a government that values culture. So this healthy situation has emerged over the last 50 years since public funding was devolved to Scotland in 1967. And a lot of these institutions that we have and populate the landscape at the moment were started by artists from the late 60s through to the 80s. And over the last 50 years, they've grown into well-resourced, well-funded institutions. So for artists living and working in Scotland, we have a very healthy ecology. The National Galleries is obviously the leader, and it shows big international shows, but it also shows Scottish artists. But in my previous role, I was working for an organisation that provided studio space, funding opportunities, skills training for artists as well. So I want to highlight both of these things, because I think a healthy ecology needs to support the production as well as the display of visual art.
Amanda, could you tell us a little bit about your context?
Sure. I'm just green with envy, but again, the sand is always pinker on the other side. So I'm the executive director at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, which is a quasi-governmental institution. So I'm somewhere in between the National Gallery of Jamaica and another sort of freer institution. So we're funded by the government, but I do not really answer to them in the sense I speak to my board. The board is responsible for the gallery. It's a very young space, so even though it's a national gallery, we're still really finding ourselves. The nation became independent in 1973 only, and the National Art Gallery was founded in 2003. So we're really still very much working with, very important to us at the institution. We just rewrote our mission statement this year, and it says that we collect, preserve, exhibit, and interpret historic and contemporary Bahamian visual art. So that's one of the issues, is that we're in our mandate, and I think psychologically the nation and the government would like to see only Bahamian art there, but as art professionals, everyone working within the building and the board feel that of course it's very important to have dialogue with other countries and to show what happens elsewhere. So we constantly sort of struggle with that nationalism of being a small country that hasn't been looked at or supported and wanting to strut our stuff, but also still welcoming people from other places. So mostly now we've been reaching out to the region. We have a series of shows called Double Dutch, where we bring regional artists to discuss issues that are pertinent. And of course, the biggest issue, and I think the biggest thing our institution is trying to do, is speak to decolonization. And something we're doing with our collection. We write on it extensively. So that's really our main focus in terms of nation building and being an institution that can sort of lead the way in terms of what we want our society to be and how we want it to look post-colony. We have very few opportunities for artists here. I think we're everything to everybody. But I very often have to say to many people, whether it's artists or, even other professionals, that's actually not what a museum does. That shouldn't be what we have to do. But very often we do have to do it. So we educate, we provide a space for even young and emerging artists, which I think is unusual, because we don't have any galleries. We don't really have commercial galleries like you might have in Scotland. A few more have been beginning to pop up, so the ecosystem is sort of growing. We have more opportunities for cultural workers now. Young Bahamians have possibly 2, if not 3 institutions they could go work at, or maybe not institutions, but spaces. But they also come with their problems. So one of them is a space in a large hotel, which is an active gallery and artist studio space, which is really doing interesting work, but it's got this sort of problematic of being tied to the tourist industry, which really changes everything we do here and affects our artists and our cultural workers. We don't really have major art schools here. We can educate artists up to the associate level, but to get a BA or MA, they have to leave the country. We don't really have any critical opportunities. They're not teaching it at University of the Bahamas, so that's something we also do at the gallery, try to teach people about critical writing. We don't really have a lot of studio space. We don't really have a lot of skills training. So again, those are all things that sort of the National Art Gallery takes on in workshops and things like that to try to broaden that dialogue and discourse. It's the same as O'Neill spoke to. In general, I'd say our general population and often in the government, they think of culture as being tied to heritage. So contemporary art and things that aren't considered quote unquote Bahamian, which is a very narrow idea, can be looked at with some kind of, scorn or perhaps just not understanding. So that's kind of a big challenge that we have. And we do try. We have a fairly healthy budget, I have to say. The government has been supportive, and so we are able to support programming, to give small stipends for production and things like that. But we can't do a lot in terms of sending people away, which I think would be really useful for more education. So I think that's sort of it. In terms of fitting into the ecosystem, we sort of, in a weird way, we are. I mean, there are other spaces, but I suppose we're the major generator. And what I think we really need is to support more grassroots organizations and more commercial spaces and experimental spaces where artists can make a living and also just grow their practice. Because right now people are experimenting on the national platform, which again wouldn't be the norm in another place.
What's the thing that you think your ecosystem has in abundance?
I've been listening to what everyone has been saying, and I've been reflecting on this a little bit more than I did before we started the interview. I think that one of the things that I hope, and I think we all can say, is that we have there's a lot of, raw talent. That's the thing that I think we have in abundance in the Jamaican ecosystem. I think most of us can share that as well. What I am also very thankful for, as kind of Amanda's statement reminded me of, that is that we do have an art school. We do have an art school that serves mostly Jamaica, but also the wider Caribbean to some extent, and it produces phenomenal art. Artists who go on to either actively engage with the local and also the international art scene. So I think those are, that's something that those are two things that I think we can be very grateful for. The fact that we have spaces like the National Gallery that we can, to some modest degree, do some experimentation. We have our limitations because we are firmly under the government, but we also do get support from the government for particular initiatives. I think that we do have spaces like NLS as well. I have to give a shout out that are independent spaces, and I am seeing some other initiatives potentially on the horizon. So I think that, we have the potential for growth. That's what I think is really good and there's interest as well. There is interest and growing interest in what we're doing. So I think those are the things that we have in abundance right now, but talent, definitely.
I would echo what O'Neill said. I think Bahamians are known to be what we call very biggity. I would say per capita, we probably have more talented creatives here than a lot of other countries. So it is astounding in the region. But in our very small countries, the creative spirit burns very bright. And I think we have an abundance of artists. I think the word raw talent is very appropriate because there's some that needs shaping and crafting and more feedback and criticism and things that we don't have a lot of. We have a very supportive scene. So I think what we have in abundance, which is I haven't seen in that many other spaces, is true support from the older generation to the younger generation. A lot of younger artists coming up today always speak to their elders and say, well, they gave me so much time, they gave me so much advice. We have, I wouldn't say an abundance of collectors, because again, to put it in context for those that don't know as well, the Bahamas is 360,000 people. So we're like a little small town in any other nation. So it's a very small community. But in that community, like I said, it's a high number of creatives and talented creatives. And for our small place, there is quite an active collecting group that at least supports artists when they're in all the stages of their career. Not that maybe they can make their living off that, but that they feel challenged and appreciated enough to continue. We also, again, get decent funding from the government. And I think we have people that are interested. Our last opening, we had about 600 people for the show, which was a lot, and young people. So we also have an audience that wants to know more, and I think even a public that wants to know more. So those things I'm also grateful for.
I prefer to refer only to Rio de Janeiro, because I think if I try to refer to the whole country of Brazil, I can be a little bit unfair, because perhaps more than a country is almost a continent. So yeah, I'm gonna keep my opinions and my analysis only referring to Rio. I think that what we have in abundance in Rio, perhaps is a cliche about Brazilian art, Brazilian culture, or Rio's culture, is creativity. I think somehow Amanda also said it about the Bahamas. I think that we have a very good, I say the artistic community has a very good ability of doing a lot with almost nothing most of the times. If you look at the recent history of Brazilian art, you see examples as, like Elliot Sica, like Ligia Clark, all of them from Rio, and all of them doing art with very precarious materials, doing art with whatever they had in their hands. And I think that somehow that continues in the art scene in Rio. And I think that this has a lot to do with the informality of the art system there. So, for example, if you compare Rio to São Paulo, you have we have less universities in Rio, we have less opportunities in Rio, less artist-run spaces, for example. And I think that makes the artists connecting one with each other and not quickly with the market, for example. So I think this informal way that things happen in Rio make everybody somehow working together with other people, and also show us quickly that we need to do something by ourselves, because it's not the government that's going to save us or is going to give us opportunity. We need to to focus our energy in collective experiences and do projects all together. So I think that this sense of informal teamwork and this ability to work with whatever we have, I think it's what we have in abundance.
I think something we have in abundance is actually access for our artists. I think they have a big group of professionals here that are very accessible, and I think we have that as well.
Dan.
Yeah, I agree with this. I think artists all over the world are great at self-organizing. They're open. They want to speak to other artists. They want to work with other artists. Scotland's well provided for, and still the artists like to complain. Artists like to complain. That's part of their job in a way, to irritants and to upset the status quo. But I think in terms of abundance, I would say, we are well resourced. We have great things. We're well funded, but a lot of these things have only come into being because groups of artists self-organized and took it upon themselves to develop the things that they needed to develop their careers. So what they needed was a means of production, a way in which they could work and produce work. And what they needed was a system of distribution, a mechanism by introducing that work to the public, by which they could introduce the work to the public. So while we have great resources and good funding, none of it would be there without the drive and the self-organization of the artists that have been coming through Scotland over the last 50 years. So I think that underpins much of the ecosystem that we experience today.
Having talked about what we have in abundance, now we probably talk about the thing that we talk about most often, right? What we really need in our ecosystems. Let's start with Amanda.
Okay, I'm going to try to keep this short because we need it all. But we did just also finish our strategic plan and our goals. And our goals really speak to a lot of the needs because, like I said, the National Art Gallery feels like we have to fill all those needs. One of them is very small. It's actually decent storage. We're losing all of our cultural heritage through weather events, and all of our major collections are stored in, possibly not the best locations. And that's a sort of a silly thing almost to talk about, but it's, again, really, really important when you think about the weather events we've been having in the region. And we just lost 3 islands that are now completely uninhabitable, and we've lost everything to do with their cultures and their history last year, and those people now have no homes, and that could happen in New Providence quite easily. So we need to really think about securing our securing all of our historical and contemporary things that are of value to us. Educating and putting art into the schools in a much more impactful way, I think, is something we really need to do, that people understand how art can really save communities. We suffer from extreme social situations here that, again, many in the region are familiar with. And I, as a kind of art champion, feel that art is the solution, and not the solution, but it's a way to speak to and find solutions for a lot of those things. Professionalizing our community, so important. We have all this talent, but again, many artists don't know how to do a studio visit, or how to do an application, how to do a grant, how to speak to the institution, how to speak to each other, how to present their work, all those things that are sort of taken for granted in other places. Also professionalizing in terms of having actual critical discourse, because we're so supportive. I think sometimes that's detrimental to us. Everyone is always like, oh, that's so amazing and that's so great, and which is really nice, but some artists really need to be able to take the criticism that a professional would give. Again, just one of our goals is so huge. It's facilitate an arts paradigm shift, which is like, okay, that's 20 years in the making. But just, I think in any country, our parents still are concerned when their children say they want to be in the arts. So it's really a struggle for people to stay true to their creative drive, because our society doesn't really think that's a valuable thing. Most of the students that aren't doing well in school are put into art classes. Most of the government workers who are not performing well in their ministry get stuck in the Ministry of Youth, Sport and Culture. It's basically, art is seen as a place to put the people that can't achieve anything else. And I think, again, that leads to a way of looking at art professionals and artists as marginal. So I think that's probably our biggest challenge.
Yeah, besides working as a curator, I will also work as a visual arts professor in a federal high school in Rio. And I think that's one of the most important things that we need, not only in Rio, but in Brazil. And I also, of course, I thought about it after listening to Amanda now. I think that's art education is one thing. I mean, we really should have in the whole country a better system of education, a better system of classes of visual arts. And with this, I think also that talking specifically about Rio, I think we really need more artist-run spaces, because what happens in Rio is that everything is very informal. Everything happens in a very ephemeral way. For example, the New Year's generation of artists that work mainly with performance. But sometimes I think that's important to have a more institutional experience, let's say like that, or even better, a more architectural experience, or the experience of installing the exhibition, doing the opening, receiving critics, and dialoguing, etc. And I think that sometimes we really miss it in Rio. It's all about doing, of course, the work with what you have in your hands, at the same time doing the work in a very, very informal way, which is important. But sometimes I think that we also should have more independent institutions created by the artists, because somehow this would give a more professional layer to our environment there. So I really miss it, and I think that's something that that many friends have been talking about it, and many people are already thinking about organizing themselves and creating new spaces there.
I think that a lot of times a lot of the conversations around what we need in our ecosystem here in Jamaica has been around spaces. It's been around, the fact that we have so few spaces that few spaces that artists can use as a platform, as well as spaces, as a diversity within those spaces. You have very independent spaces, you have like the large national institution. But I think in reality, what we really need is increased capacity amongst our art professionals. One of the things, because if you don't have people who know how to operate those spaces, run those spaces, seek funding, liaise with artists properly, critique artists, write about those things, then that's a larger problem. I mean, we can provide, the government can one day just decide to provide all these spaces. We have an initiative now about making Kingston, downtown Kingston, a creative hub. Having all these spaces opened up to the artistic community, but having spaces is one thing. Having people who know what to do with those spaces is, I think, more important. A lot of the people who the majority of people that I know that have, some comprehensive curatorial knowledge have had that as on-the-job training, and that's on-the-job training at the National Gallery of Jamaica. We need more than that small cohort of people. I think we need people, and we have even fewer people who have the capacity to write about art. To write about our culture in a critical way. I mean, the thing, what you were saying, Amanda, about, a lot of times, a lot of the people who engage with the artists are more celebratory. This is wonderful. This was great. You're so great. You're doing such a good job. We have a lot of that, but then we have people who are either reticent about putting their opinions out there because it might be seen as a negative, or people who just aren't comfortable with it. So I think really building capacity in those fields is what I think is the greatest need here. Not so much the spaces that everybody talks about, but people who know what to do with the spaces and engage with the spaces.
That was a really interesting shift you made there, O'Neill. Are there still things that you feel like your ecosystem needs, Dan?
The system in Scotland is very healthy, but it is uncertain in some ways, because what the government gives, the government can also take away. And in terms of infrastructure, there's very few commercial contemporary galleries in Scotland. I mean, of course, London and Europe is accessible, and the art market is globalized, but the mechanism by which Scottish artists can access this is limited. The commercial sector is important as it supports artists economically, but it is also a validator and a platform for artists nationally and internationally. At the other end of the spectrum, though, it could be argued that public funding has brought about a culture of dependency, and the question of how organisations might deal with changes in this funding is a primary concern for most organizations at the moment. So, I mean, certainty would be something that we would be looking for if you're working within an arts organization. But another thing is, I think that, we all wish for that, of course. But another thing is that changes in the education system are meaning that it's becoming a very middle-class activity. It's not a very diverse intake of students. And this is going to have implications for the future, because it is based on, I suppose, a small group who can afford to go through the education system. And that's going to rapidly change the makeup of the people who form the ecosystem in the future. And it will be a narrower economic spectrum of people who are coming and becoming artists. And I think a healthy community is a diverse community. So, whilst we do live in a very privileged place as artists or curators or writers, there are problems in the future, mainly around sustainability or the ability of people to access visual arts as a career, as artists.
Sustainability is, of course, a concern for art institutions and communities of all kinds, but what is at stake for your institution in considering sustainability and how are you managing sustainability issues? So I want to start with you, Dan. You brought this up a little bit before.
Yeah.
You were speaking, I thought about, for example, Transmission, that art space in Scotland that lost their government funding. So I know that this is something that you're thinking about, even with the kind of abundance that you guys have. Could you tell me a little bit about how you guys are addressing those issues?
Yes, well, I mean, Transmission is a great example. Transmission is a famous artist-run space. It's internationally renowned. It's supported by people like Douglas Gordon, big artists who've come through the Glasgow system. And recently, it didn't lose all of its funding, but it was cut from a regularly funded status, and the result was that it received less money. Now, this is something that's happening across the spectrum. In the UK, we've been going through a period of relative austerity, and this has been manifesting as cuts across the board, not just in the visual arts. In Scotland, we've been insulated from this a little bit because our government is very pro-culture, and it has tried to mitigate some of these cuts that they're having from central government. But all organizations are trying, for their own safety, are trying to become less dependent on the public purse, so that they can mitigate for any potential cuts or changes in government that might create a hostile environment for them. I mean, this is problematic because you are dependent, and I think the strategies for being sustainable would be true to all organizations. Don't become moribund and stay relevant. Support your peers and constantly think about what you're doing. Do things because they're good things to do, not because of funding stipulations or because other people are doing them. And understand that things change and are always changing, and that sustainability is fundamentally about negotiating the current paradigm and identifying future trajectories and planning for the next evolution. But then we touched on it earlier, and there's a sort of environmental sustainability. I mean, I'm pessimistic that our current combined efforts are doing little to stem the tide of climate change. But I think you can't talk about sustainability without talking about impact. And all organisations in Scotland are committed to reducing their carbon, reducing emissions, and recycling, reusing, and not just energy, but anything. Rather than be profligate with the financial support that we get, it's about using that in the most sensible way possible. I think that cuts will be coming, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in Scotland over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think everyone in an institution is thinking about the future cuts. I feel like even in terms of sociologically, how I said we were like being in London in the 60s, I feel like we're sort of a decade behind maybe, because right now the government's been quite generous, and that's wonderful. And I think it will continue because the institution's been doing very well and expanding, and it's always sort of good news. Culture is good news. We do good work. I mean, our work is very, speaking to staying relevant, what's important for our community is really our interested people care about the exhibitions, and all of the professionals within the institution do, but really for the general community, what they're interested in seeing is that we're out in the underserved communities, reaching them and educating. So really how I can fundraise the most is through speaking to education and how art can help raise grades and be an educational thing. So we really have to very strongly underscore the educational arm of what we do. Readers and critics who sort of love our exhibitions and our programming, that's actually probably less interesting for our local audience and the government. And we have to think about revenue generating, of course. And I think this is something that everyone all over the world is doing. We were just trying to create a 501c3 because we have a lot of second homeowners here who we think would give more if they could write it off on their taxes in the US. But, I've been speaking to a lot of people in the States, and a lot of nonprofits in the States are becoming B Corps instead of, which is a proper corporation, and it's a revenue generating corporation, because giving is going down as well as government going down. So I think, like I said, we're about 10 years behind. So we're just beginning to, because of the growth of the institution and the work we're doing and the good press we're getting, and etc. We're at a point where we have quite a nice fund where we're probably going to be getting more donations in the future from private individuals. But I think if I look forward, we're going to be looking at the same situation that others are facing right now. So I'm thinking about my sort of 10-year plan. And that's quite scary, because yes, it will run dry. I think I have a little bit longer to prepare for it, but I also have a much smaller community to look to. And one of the ways we can generate revenue outside of events and paid things and what have you, or weddings at the facility, is of course tourism, and that's majorly problematic in terms of what we then have to have at the institution to get tourists to pay to come in. That's probably that's our only major source of revenue as a nation, is tourism. And that, of course, can really negatively impact authentic culture and development. So it's a big struggle. So yeah.
O'Neill?
Wow, well, in terms of sustainability, I think the thing that is of most concern to us is maintaining relevance, because we have to be relevant to our funders, the government of Jamaica, as well as independent funders here and internationally. We have to keep programming that engages with our audience, the millennials and whatever letter of the alphabet comes after Generation Z. It's really about keeping our programming engaging to the people who matter, and the people who matter are the people who walk through the doors of our institution. They have to be engaged, they have to be excited, they have to come in numbers, because all of us who have to write up reports know that it's a numbers game, unfortunately, a lot of the time. So in terms of sustainability, it really is keeping our engagement, expanding our engagement, and remaining, as I said, relevant, because you can do something exciting and avant-garde and nobody wants to come and see it. So even if you do something that has, you have to be careful in, I guess, maintaining relevance and not pandering. So for us, sustainability really is that delicate balance between doing what our institution needs to do, but also keeping people excited and coming back for more.
Yeah, about the museum, when I think about sustainability there, I think about two different issues. First of them, it's our collection, because the museum was built around the collection of João Santamini, a very important collector in Rio. He recently passed away this last year. And then when I think about sustainability, I think about the possibility of the collection continuing in the museum. That's a big issue to us. We have a loan agreement for the next 3 years, but for the museum keeping on being the same, the collection should be there. It should be part of our institutional. And then when I think about the future, that's my main concern. How to dialogue with the family, how to see if it's possible for the collection continuing there. And also referring to this, since the museum is a public museum, we really don't have a big we really don't have a big budget. All the budget comes from the mayorship of Niterói. And now we just started to recreate, because the museum had in the past, but it was, they finished it. Now we're opening again the association of friends of the museum. And we think that also with a bigger presence of different public people from the visual arts in Rio, perhaps little by little we can start receiving small donations and at the same time expand a little bit our budget. And with expansions like this, perhaps it would be possible and be easier to keep with the collection there, to keep somehow with the identity that the museum built in these 22 years.
So in a widely debated blog post, curator Rennie Pritikin offered a prescription for a healthy art scene. And he included things like a large pool of artists, teaching opportunities to support artists, affordable studio space, sophisticated writers, and adventurous collectors. What a list. Pritikin is chief curator of the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. And I'm curious to know if you think the same prescription can be applied to all art scenes, whether it's Pritikin's or some other, or do we need to kind of generate our own lists? How do you kind of respond to or reflect on this kind of prescription?
I actually was a little incredulous when I went through the entire listing that Pritikin had prescribed. Let's put it that way, because I don't think that it is applicable to all art scenes. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's applicable to his art scene. I think that it's a listing of a lot of ideals, but I think that if you generally had all of those things, you might have a very bland art scene. I feel that a lot of art has come out of, a lot of some of the best contemporary art has come out of adversity, has come out of artists trying to work around not having all of these, these wonderful things, access to specialized materials, or opportunities for artists to get involved in politics, which I think can go either way. That can go very dangerous. I think that, I mean, they're all good things, but affordable studio space, oh God, I wish that more artists had that. Sophisticated writers, well, I already went off on a rant about that, so I don't need to go anywhere with that one. Adventurous collectors, I think those are all good things within of themselves, but I think if we have all of those things, we will then begin to have very generic art scenes. And I think that the one of the key themes, or the key theme of the last Tilting Axis conference, was about art ecosystems. And I think that one of the things that we have to, we're all aware of, but that we have to acknowledge, is that we all exist in different art ecosystems. There's no one prescription for what we all need. I think that in every ecosystem, we have different things. We have different things that are, what we might consider bad, and things that we might consider that are good for all of us. But I think that all of them work together, for better or worse, to create the uniqueness of our art ecosystem. So I personally have issues with the long list from Pritkin, because I think that if we had all of those things, we wouldn't have a dynamic art system at all.
And just for our listeners, Tilting Axis is a roving conference that invites arts practitioners of all kinds from across the Caribbean region every year to talk about issues relevant to the Caribbean art scene. So just to say that, so people know what O'Neill is talking about. Yeah. Amanda, tell us a little bit about what you think about Pritikin.
Well, I think, it's always terrible going after O'Neill, because he's so articulate and says everything I want to say. Can I be first on the list? But I think, and Raphael actually spoke to that as well when he was speaking about his ecosystem in Rio, of kind of sometimes making do. Like we did a show in Cuba, and a couple of years ago we did a Bahamian art show, and we think here like, oh, we struggle so much, we don't have anything, and then we got there, and if we wanted some more bubble wrap, we had to call Nassau and have it flown over on a plane because we couldn't get any. So, and you see just that there is something about you expand into your own scene. You work with what you have. So I think what O'Neill said is so true. It's like, yes, on that list, there are many positive things, but I agree that it would almost be impossible to have all of them. And each scene requires different ones. And if everybody was the same, and I say that to my children when they're talking about people that they don't want to deal with, and I say, what a boring world it would be if everyone was the same and everyone thought the same and everyone wanted and you liked everything. It would just be so dull. So again, there are many points that are very valuable, but I just agree very much with what O'Neill said, and that you can't have them all, and nor should you probably.
Yeah. Raphael?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's also very complicated to say something interesting after O'Neill and after Amanda also. But no, I would say that I agree with what you two said. I mean, I think that, of course, it's an idealistic list. I think that there are very interesting things there. But what called my attention was the fact that it's a list mainly about infrastructure of the idea of a healthy art scene. I mean, he talks about critic, he talks about institutions, studios, and reflecting from my practice in the Rio scene, I really miss in a healthy art scene more social debates, more social criteria. For example, I really miss in this list a reflection about how the art system should give opportunity to privileged and unprivileged artists that come from very different social backgrounds, something that we don't see commonly in Rio. We see artists that come from the south zone of the city, the beach zone, the richest zone, being artists, and artists that come from the suburbs don't having the same opportunity. I really miss in the prescription for a healthy art scene more reflection about gender, more reflection about race, about artists from different generations also. So I think that this list could have some other ideas for criteria to have a more mixed, a more diverse and healthy art scene.
Nice. I like that. Yeah, thank you very much for that. And you had mentioned some of the things that Raphael just said in some of your earlier comments. So do you have anything to add on the subject of Pritikins' healthy art scene?
Well, I think everyone summed the shortcomings up very clearly. I am very skeptical of manifestos in general. But I would agree. I think for a healthy art scene, all you really need is a group of artists, a group of people who share the same concerns and passion for art, and they work together to do it better, support themselves, provide platforms, interact regularly. So, I think healthy art scenes, require artists, and artists are pretty good at making the things that they need to promote their work or make their work or survive.
How do you approach working with other institutions, and how significant has collaboration been in your programming and your working towards this better ecosystem? Amanda, we're starting with you this time. You see, I was listening.
Yay! I know. I was like, yeah, I get to go first. We believe, again, very, very strongly in collaboration. We have worked with other institutions. The National Art Gallery of Jamaica is one of them, National Gallery of Jamaica. And that, whoop, whoop. And so those have both been really valuable for us in terms of just creating, first of all, and I think probably when you're in Scotland, this might sound weird, but certainly in the Bahamas and even in Jamaica, very often those of us doing our jobs are the only people in our entire countries doing that job. And so it can be very isolating, and creating networks, working with other institutions, specifically in the region, but also, of course, it's beneficial to work with institutions outside of the region, is a really wonderful thing to do in terms of support. And it's kind of like we get on these kind of conversations, and it's like group therapy. So it's very important to see like what works, what doesn't work. We have sent our teams to work at other institutions, and we've invited people from those institutions to come work at our institution just to see like if we can help each other. What do we do best? What do they do best? How can we learn from each other? Because again, we don't have these no one here has a curatorial management degree. They don't exist in the Bahamas. Maybe some of us go away and get them and come back, but we are learning on the job. And so these partnerships with other institutions are really useful for that as well. Knowledge sharing, knowledge building. We also collaborated with the National Gallery in Cayman. We've shared costs on shows with both of those places that I've mentioned as well, that shows we couldn't have otherwise hosted because we wouldn't have been able to do it just on our own. And so we've been able to sort of spread our budgets and support each other by sharing shows that maybe we tailor a little bit to our own context. And O'Neill spoke to that too, being relevant to our context. So one of the shows we just showed was We Suffer to Remain with Graham Fagan. And that's what we called it, but it was basically all based on Graham Fagan's work, The Slave's Lament, and it went to various places in the region with an adaptation to its site to make it relevant to our own community. So those have been really, really valuable. And of course, working with institutions from overseas is extremely important too. So we've had very positive experiences, and for our programming, it's brought richer layers and richer discourses. We tend to, as a very small nation, be very insular, obviously, because that's where the word comes from. And we tend to sort of navel gaze. And when I came home one time with my husband and we'd been away and we turned on the radio, and, you know, we just talk about ourselves all day long on talk radio, and we tend to look inward. And so it's really, really valuable to have these partnerships from outside, to look at ourselves critically, and to just understand how we fit into a more global context. So I try to approach them to say, how do I approach them on a very human level? So I think relationship building is so important, and every positive experience we've had has been through relationships, through people. It's always through people.
Well, I think that partnerships are everything. In our 2 years working at MAC, me and Pablo León de la Barra, we've been working with many partners. So, for example, all the artists that did solo shows in the museum and that had galleries, all the galleries supported the show somehow. Some of them, of course, promoting the show. Others of them could also help producing some of the works. And that's very good for our budget, and also to build this kind of friendship between the institution and some galleries. And besides that, I think recently we had a very good example of collaborating with São Paulo Art Museum, because they were creating a show around Sonia Gomes, a very important artist from Belo Horizonte, but now she lives in São Paulo. And then the team of MAC and the team of São Paulo Art Museum worked together in the catalog. So I was happy to edit the catalog with Amanda, the creator of the show in São Paulo. And that was very good, not only because of the catalog itself, but also because we were able to learn one with the other. So I think it's also about making the shows possible, but also learn from different infrastructures. For example, I never forget the first meeting we had with the team of the São Paulo Art Museum. And then people were very surprised about the size of our team at MAC, for example. At MAC work only me and Pablo, and in São Paulo they work, they have, I think, 10 curators or something like that. So I think we all worked a lot with our differences. And I think that's also very important when you have partners.
Amanda already spoke very eloquently, my dear, to our regional partnerships. And I think that that's one of the things that when we are these smaller institutions within, the larger space, when we work together on those partnerships, we are able to achieve a whole lot more. I think that, what my dream is that more of the nations of the global South will work together, in our unique context to, create bigger and better things. But I actually want to just to keep it on topic, to reference our gallery in Montego Bay, because I had mentioned that earlier, that we had a branch, National Gallery West, in Montego Bay, which is specifically to serve our Western audiences, since it's sometimes difficult for people to come into Kingston, even though when you look on Rio or so on, it's like, what's the big deal with that distance? The thing is that that particular organization is the result of several partnerships. It is the result of a partnership between the Institute of Jamaica, which is our parent organization, the National Gallery of Jamaica, the National Museum of Jamaica, the St. James Municipal Corporation, the Montego Bay Arts Council, and the Tourism Enhancement Fund, which is the major funder for the project. So all of those institutions and organizations have to come together to make this Western space, this Western museum gallery space work. And I think that everybody has a particular agenda. Whatever we're doing, everybody has an agenda. And when you're able to make all your agendas align, even with that many stakeholders, I think that is really showcasing the fact that we can make it happen. There's very, very little that can happen in Jamaica, and I think in the wider Caribbean, that can happen without people coming together and making it happen, because partnerships are what are what make us able to do what we do as cultural professionals.
Thank you. And Dan?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much more I can add to that. It's when you go last, everything's been said. But I mean, the partnerships are essential to operation for any individual or organization. For the National Galleries, as Raphael said, the galleries support the program, and the commercial galleries, if the artists have them, help to support the program, and the National Galleries support the artists and promote them to a wider audience beyond the commercial sector. But I want to speak a little bit about Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop, where I was previously, because partnerships were so integral to setting up and developing a program around this organization. And the local partnerships, we had a partnership with a university that allowed us to develop a research program that sat between the two institutions, and that's been extremely useful for both organizations as the knowledge flows between us, but also because of the people who have participated in that program. So this program has produced, people doing PhDs, or has produced research, and it actually produces and generates new knowledge. And partnerships are a good way of going about that. And similarly, Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop, we've done partnerships internationally. So we've worked with the art schools in Iceland, in Reykjavik. We've worked with the Kochi Biennial to deliver an education program. Last year, we did a residency exchange with an organization in Argentina. And this year, we're going to do one with Japan. And most of these organizations, us included, are asset rich but cash poor. And partnerships are a great way of sharing the assets, and also a great way of just opening up pathways for cultural exchange.
Thank you, Dan. So for our last question, I would like to know, what is your vision for your ecosystem's future? And if you could tell me about just one program that you think most directly speaks to that vision for the future that your institution has done, or and several of you have worked with multiple institutions, so it doesn't have to be the institution you're currently working with, but what's the future you're looking at, and what do you think is a program that has most directly spoken to that proposed future? O'Neill, start us off, please.
Wow, and I'll keep it brief. I think I mentioned it earlier that I think greater capacity building. That's the thing that that's part of my vision for, or not just my vision, our vision as an institution for the future. We want more people who can do more, who will do more, who will help the ecosystem to develop the way it needs to be. I think that we are focused now currently on conservation. I think that that's one thing that it's one skill that is even rarer than curatorial skill here in Jamaica. We have very few, I think maybe 2 or 3 people who you consider to be conservators. And what we're really doing is seeking funding. We've been working on developing programs. We're seeking funding from several partners like the U.S. Ambassadors Fund, like Chase, like the Tourism Enhancement Fund. That is what we are working on right now. In terms of the future, our exhibition programming is always at the center of what we are hoping will chart the path. We're looking on exhibitions that will create more diversity, that will, I suppose, help our audiences to engage more and help the artistic scene develop. So we have our exhibition programming, which I can't really speak about totally right now because it's in development, but it's really focusing on our exhibition programming to stay relevant.
Thank you. Amanda?
Well, a lot of what O'Neill said again, I did speak to the you know, a lot of our future is sort of bound up in a building right now, which sounds silly, but the building addresses all the things that we want to achieve. So we're about to also embark on a large capital campaign to expand that. When the National Art Gallery was created, it's in a historic building, which you can see on the little picture, and no one thought about back office, or really it's like a picture gallery for hanging things on the wall. So we need, again, to use O'Neill's word, capacity for storage, for administrative, for education. Again, education for us is really important, reaching out into our underserved communities, to allow for more student engagement and more scholarship, to be able to access the collection more easily. Our collection is stored quite well, but it's hard to get to, so we can't let students or people go in there. For safety and security, we need to create a space that will preserve the cultural heritage of really everybody, not just our collection. There's other major collections here too. So all of those issues. I mean, O'Neill has an on-staff conservator, I think. We don't have anyone in the Bahamas who can do conservation. We have to bring people in. So that training, that knowledge growth is so important to us. And that building is really just a sort of flagship I'd like to see actually a network. And we're already beginning. I'm hoping that by the end of the year, we will have opened an annex. So for those of you that don't know, the Bahamas is an archipelago. The main island, which the museum is on, is actually one of the smallest islands, and we have quite a lot of population living on other islands. Our museum is known as the NAGB, and very often people say it wrong. They say the Nassau Art Gallery, and I'm like, no, it's the National Art Gallery. So for us, logistics are really problematic. And the most important program that we've had, I think, in the last few years has been the Inter-Island Traveling Exhibition. Prior to a few years ago, no one on a family island, which is what we call our other islands, had seen the national collection or had seen an actual real piece of artwork by one of our major artists, because they don't really exist on those islands except in private homes of perhaps second homeowners. So really giving access to the entire nation is really important to me. And we've been taking the collection to these other islands. So but it's been very problematic in terms of exhibition space and humidity control. So I'd like to see like a network of little mini NAGBs on the family islands where, again, we can educate, we can wrap art into educational programming, and again, speak to conservation, because you have to value those things before you care about conserving them. So we need to really expand on that.
Oh, thanks, Amanda. Raphael?
Well, when me and Pablo, when we started working at the museum, the first thing we did was to do a research about the history of exhibitions there, because we had already a 20 years history. And then all of our program was based on that, because we noticed that in 20 years of the museum, only less than 15% of the exhibitions, of the solo shows, were by women artists. And we also noticed that even with 200 exhibitions in 20 years, only one solo show was by Black artists. And then in these 2 years we've been trying to write new histories for the museum. So I think that when I think about the future, I think about keeping up with the program we have, keeping up opening the museum to many voices, especially in a very complex society like Brazil is. As you know, we're in the middle of a big political turn in Brazil, right? It's the Bolsonaro era now. And I think that more than ever, it's important to have, of course, more women artists in the museums, more Black artists in the museums, more Native artists in the museum also. So I think I have all these elements in my mind when I think about the future. And beside that, I also think that is essential to us to start to build our own collection of art. I mean, we have Satamini's collection, but it's very important to have our own collection. We already have around 600 works that came by donation these 20 years, but we never really had a program to acquire new works, never had a plan to receive new artworks. So I think it's about working with exhibitions, giving space to multiple voices, and at the same time, building this collection by the museum itself.
Thank you. And Dan?
Well, predicting the future can make everyone seem stupid in a few years' time. We're similarly in a very volatile political situation at the moment. I don't know if anyone is following it outside Europe, but the the UK is currently trying to negotiate its exit from the European Union, and that will certainly, all the indications are, it will be pretty catastrophically economically for a while, and it's uncertain what the makeup of the UK will look like after a few years after this. So I'm not going to try and give you a vision for the future. I think, though, we touched on it earlier, and I don't want to end this on a downer, but we'll probably all be facing cuts here, and we'll need to find new ways of operation, new modes of expression to survive. And like O'Neill said earlier on, I think often austerity and hardship produces much more interesting art. But in terms of the national galleries, we're planning. We have a huge collection, most of which we don't have space to show, and we're currently planning a big development which is going to provide storage, but also access to the public for this collection as well. And that's very important because it's not the National Gallery's collection. It belongs to the people of Scotland, and it should be able to be accessed by them. In terms of Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop, I think what they're doing down there at the moment is actually laying the foundations of a healthy future contemporary ecosystem, because what they're doing is they're supporting emerging artists, they're subsidizing their development, and they're helping them learn. But even more than that, they're also working with school children, they're working with 10-year-olds, and they have a long-term engagement with the visual arts. So hopefully, at one end, my activity is going to allow the public to access more of their collection of the nation. And at the other end of my work, we're producing the next generation of articulate and dynamic and skilled artists.